I'm aware that I'm live right now. I just had so much fun with that face. um, Hello, welcome to I don't know what day it is, but I really want to say it. Welcome to a day in a long list of days of Sense and Sensibility. I was just thinking to myself this morning about Sense and Sensibility, about how thank you, Shiv, about how Jane Austen like weeds you out in the first 10 to 15 chapters is like, I'm going to talk about houses for a couple chapters now. And then she's like, but now I will reward those of you who stayed with some really good romance plot, which is where we've hit. We've hit the really good, meaty stuff that you can make into a film adaptation if your name is Emma Thompson. Hello, Dane. Yeah, so I was just thinking about her genius, her mind. We love Jane Austen in this house, and in most other houses, to be honest with you. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. I did a really good job today in not letting my room overheat. Usually, the sun blasts in through this window in the morning, and then it comes through that window over there. Ooh, look, I'm so strong. But I closed this window really good in the morning, and I closed that one right when it started to shift, so it's nice and cool in my room. I feel really accomplished. Good work, me. That's how they did air conditioning in the old days. It was called using your brain. And having blackout curtains, so I can't really claim to fame. Let's talk about what happened yesterday. So yesterday, and this time I actually know instead of having to be like, ugh, let's see if I can figure it out. So yesterday, the Miss Dashwoods, I almost said the Bennets, the Miss Dashwoods were invited to go to London by Miss Jennings. And Eleanor was like, no, we can't do that. And Marianne was like, but why? And then Eleanor was like, oh, God. Because Marianne's like always rude to Mrs. Jennings, and Mrs. Jennings is just a bad influence. So Eleanor was like, God damn it, I gotta go to London with these two fools and keep an eye on them. So they're convinced to go to London for about a month in the month of January. Eleanor doesn't want to go to London because she's heard that Edward is there, and she's like, I'd rather not see that scumbag, except she probably doesn't think scumbag. She probably just thinks nice man. Dane, I know you're in the Edward support club, but Edward's gonna have to do a lot to get back into my good graces. But yeah, she's like, I don't want to go because Edward might be there, but I think he's only going to be there in February, so I should be fine. Soon as they get there, Eleanor's like writing a letter to their mom. She's like, she sees Marianne writing a letter. She's like, oh, you don't have to write to mom yet. Like, why don't you wait a couple days? And Marianne's like, I'm not writing to mom. And then Eleanor's like, oh boy. But she's also like, okay, so if she can write to him freely as soon as she gets to London, probably means they're engaged. Or it means that she's a 16-year-old dumbass. Anyways. So she writes to Willoughbe, sends off this letter. We think to Willoughbe. We're pretty sure it's to Willoughbe. Like, come on, who else is it going to be to? She's like, freaking out all day. Nobody comes, nothing. And then she hears someone at the door. She runs out. She's like, oh my God, it's Willoughbe. She runs back. She's like freaking out. And then in comes Colonel Brandon. And she's so upset that it's not Willoughbe that she leaves the room immediately upon seeing Colonel Brandon, which everybody's just like, oh. And then Eleanor's like, oh my God, I have to try and fix this situation. And so she and Colonel Brandon sit there for a while being like, we're just going to ignore the fact that my sister just ran out of the room upon sight. So that's, I think, where we are. I don't think there's been, Miss Palmer's there. She's there. Poor Colonel Brandon. We're just going to, yeah. So, basically, Marianne's depressed because she hasn't heard from Willoughbe, because nothing was ever cemented with Willoughbe because he's a cad and we don't like him. But she's 16 and he seems cool. So yeah, let's see what happens today in Sense and Sensibility. It's London. Lots has got to happen. So let's get into it. If this weather, one day I'll get through the first sentence. Okay. If this open weather holds much longer, said Mrs. Jennings when they met at breakfast the following morning, Sir John will not like leaving Barton next week. 'Tis a sad thing for sportsmen to lose a day's pleasure. Poor souls, I always pity them when they do. They seem to take it so much to heart. That is true, cried Marianne in a cheerful voice, and walking to the window as she spoke to examine the day. I had not thought of that. This weather will keep many sportsmen in the country. Oh, honey, if he's not texting you back, there's only one reason. It was a lucky recollection. All her good spirits were restored by it. It is charming weather for them indeed, she continued, as she sat down to the breakfast table with a happy countenance. How much they must enjoy it! But, with a little return of anxiety, it cannot be expected to last long. At this time of year, and after such a series of rain, we shall certainly have very little more of it. Frost will soon set in, and in all probability with severity. In another day or two, perhaps, this extreme mildness can hardly last longer. Nay, perhaps it may freeze tonight. At any rate, said Eleanor, wishing to prevent Mrs. Jennings from seeing her sister's thoughts as clearly as she did, I dare say we shall have Sir John and Lady Middleton in town by the end of next week. Ay, my dear, oh dear. I think that's Miss Jennings. Ay, my dear, I'll warrant you we do. Mary always has her own way. And now, silently conjectured Eleanor, she will write to Com by this day's post. But if she did, the letter was written and sent away with a privacy which eluded all her watchfulness to ascertain the fact. Whatever the truth of it might be, and as far as Eleanor was from feeling thorough contentment about it, yet while she saw Marianne in spirits, she could not be very uncomfortable herself. And Marianne was in spirits, happy in the mildness of the weather, and still happier in her expectation of a frost. This is very interesting, I just thought. Like, two of the men in these books are, you know what? I'll keep my thoughts to myself until we find out what exactly Willoughby's been up to. The morning was chiefly spent in leaving cards at the house of Mrs. Jennings' acquaintance to inform them of her being in town, and Marianne was all the time busy in observing the direction of the wind, watching the variations of the sky, and imagining an alteration in the air. Don't you feel it colder than it was in the morning, Eleanor? There seems to be, to me, a very decided difference. I can hardly keep my hands warm even in my muff. It was not so yesterday, I think. The clouds seem parting, too, that the sun will be out in a moment, and we shall have a clear afternoon. Eleanor was alternately diverted and pained, but Marianne persevered, and saw every night in the brightness of the fire, and every morning in the appearance of the atmosphere, the certain symptoms of an approaching frost. The Miss Dashwoods had no greater reason to be dissatisfied with Mrs. Jennings' style of living and set of acquaintance than with her behavior to themselves, which was invariably kind. Everything in her household arrangements was conducted on the most liberal plan, and excepting a few old city friends whom, to Lady Middleton's regret, she had never dropped, she visited no one to whom an introduction could not at all discompose the feeling of her young companions. Pleased to find herself more comfortably situated in that particular than she had expected, Eleanor was very willing to compound for the want of much real enjoyment from any of their evening parties, which, whether at home or abroad, formed only for cards, could have little to amuse her. Colonel Brandon, who had a general invitation to the house, was with them almost every day. He came to look at Marianne, and talk to Eleanor, who derived more satisfaction from conversing with him than from any other daily occurrence, but he saw at the same time with much concern his continued regard for her sister. You guys are my Colonel Brandon. She feared it was a strengthening regard. It grieved her to see the earnestness with which he often watched Marianne, and his spirits were certainly worse than when at Barton, baby. About a week after their arrival, it became certain that Willoughby was also arrived. His card was on the table when they came in from the morning drive. Good God! Cried Marianne. He has been here while we were out! Eleanor, rejoiced to be assured of his being in London, now ventured to say, "Depend upon it he will call again tomorrow." But Marianne seemed hardly to hear her, and on Mrs. Jennings' entrance, escaped with the precious card. This event, while it raised the spirits of Eleanor, restored to those of her sister all, and more than all, their former agitation. From this moment her mind was never quiet. The expectation of seeing him every hour of the day made her unfit for anything. She insisted on being left behind the next morning when the others went out. Eleanor's thoughts were full of what might be passing in Berkeley Street during their absence, but a moment's glance at her sister when they returned was enough to inform her that Willoughbe had paid no second visit there. A note was just then brought in and laid on the table. "For me?" cried Marianne, stepping hastily forward. "No, ma'am, for my mistress." But Marianne, not convinced, took it instantly. "It is indeed for Miss Jennings. How provoking!" "You are expecting a letter, then?" said Eleanor, unable to be longer silent. "Yes, a little, not much." After a short pause, "You have no confidence in me, Marianne." "Nay, Eleanor, this reproach from you who have confidence in no one." "Me?" returned Eleanor in some confusion. "Indeed, Marianne, I have nothing to tell." "Well, nor I," answered Marianne with energy. "Our situations, then, are alike. We neither of us anything to tell. You because you communicate, and I because I conceal nothing." "Well, that's a lie, both of you, liars." Eleanor, distressed by this charge of reserve in herself, which she was not at liberty to do away, knew not how, under the circumstances, to press for greater openness in Marianne. Mrs. Jennings soon appeared, and the note being given her, she read it aloud. It was from Lady Middleton, announcing their arrival in Conduit Street the night before, and requesting the company of her mother and cousins the following evening. Business on Sir John's part, and a violent cold on her own, prevented their calling in Berkeley Street. The invitation was accepted, but when the hour of appointment drew near, necessary as it was in common civility to Mrs. Jennings that they should both attend her on such a visit, Eleanor had some difficulty in persuading her sister to go, for still she had seen nothing of Willoughbe, and therefore was not more indisposed for amusement abroad than unwilling to run the risk of his calling again in her absence. That's like getting left on red and being like, maybe he'll text. He's never gonna text, honey. Eleanor, when the evening was over, that disposition is not materially altered by a change of abode, for although scarcely settled in town, Sir John had contrived to collect around him nearly 20 young people and to amuse them with a ball. What kind of money does Sir John have? This was an affair, however, of which Lady Middleton did not approve. In the country, an unpremeditated dance was very allowable, but in London, where the reputation of elegance was more important and less easily attained, it was risking too much for the gratification of a few girls to have it known that Lady Middleton had given a small dance of 8 or 9 couples with 2 violins and a mere sideboard coalition. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer were of the party. From the former, whom they had not seen before since their arrival in town, as he was careful to avoid the appearance of any attention to his mother-in-law, and therefore never came near her, they received no mark of recognition on their entrance. He looked at them slightly, without seeming to know who they were, and merely nodded to Mrs. Jennings from the other side of the room. Marianne gave one glance round the apartment as she entered. It was enough he was not there, and she sat down equally ill-disposed to receive or communicate pleasure. After they had been assembled about an hour, Mr. Palmer sauntered toward the Miss Dashwoods to express his surprise on seeing them in town, though Colonel Brandon had been first informed of their arrival at his house, and he had himself said something very droll on hearing that they were to come. "I thought you were both in Devonshire," said he. "Did you?" replied Eleanor. "When do you go back again?" "I do not know." And thus ended their discourse. Jesus! Never had Marianne been so unwilling to dance in her life as she was that evening, and never so much fatigued by the exercise. She complained of it as they returned to Berkeley Street. "Ay," said Mrs. Jennings, "we know the reason of all that very well. If a certain person who shall be nameless had been there, you would not have been a bit tired. And to say the truth, it was not very pretty of him not to give you the meeting when he was invited." "Invited?" cried Marianne. So my daughter Middleton told me, for it seems Sir John met him somewhere in the street this morning. Marianne said no more, but looked exceedingly hurt. Impatient in this situation to be doing something that might lead to her sister's relief, Eleanor resolved to write the next morning to her mother, and hoped, by awakening her fears for the health of Marianne, to procure those inquiries which had been so long delayed. And she was still more eagerly bent on this measure by perceiving, after breakfast on the morrow, that Marianne was again writing to Willoughbe, for she could not suppose it to be any other person. About the middle of the day, Mrs. Jennings went out by herself on business, and Eleanor began her letter directly, while Marianne, too restless for employment, too anxious for conversation, walked from one window to the other, or sat down by the fire in melancholy meditation. Eleanor was very earnest in her application to her mother, relating all that had passed, her suspicions of Willoughby's inconstancy, urging her by every plea of duty and affection to demand from Marianne an account of her real situation with respect to him. Her letter was scarcely finished when a rap foretold the visitor, and Colonel Brandon was announced. The only man. Marianne, who had seen him from the window, and who hated company of any kind, left the room before he entered it. He looked more than usually grave, and though expression of satisfaction at finding Miss Dashwood alone, as if he had somewhat in particular to tell her, sat for some time without saying a word. Eleanor, persuaded that he had some communication to make in which her sister was concerned, impatiently expected its opening. It was not the first time of her feeling the same kind of conviction, for more than once before, beginning with the observation of, "Your sister looks unwell today," or "Your sister seems out of spirits," he had appeared on the point either of disclosing or of inquiring something particular about her. After a pause of several minutes, their silence was broken by him asking her in a voice of some agitation when he was to congratulate her on the acquisition of a brother. Eleanor was not prepared for such a question, and having no answer ready, was obliged to adopt the simple and common expedient of asking what he meant. He tried to smile as he replied, "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very generally known." "It cannot be generally known," returned Eleanor, "for her own family do not know it." He looked surprised, and said, "I beg your pardon. I am afraid my inquiry has been impertinent. I had not supposed any secrecy intended, as they openly correspond, and their marriage is universally talked of." "But how can that be? By whom can you have heard it mentioned?" "By many. By some of whom you know nothing, by others with whom you are most intimate, Mrs. Jennings, Mrs. Palmer, and the Middletons. But I still might not have believed it, for where the mind is perhaps rather unwilling to be convinced, it will always find something to support its doubts. If I had not, when the servant led me in today, accidentally seen a letter in his hand directed to Mr. Willoughby, in your sister's writing, I came to inquire, but I was convinced before I could ask the question. Is everything finally settled? Is it impossible to... But I have no right, and I could have no chance of succeeding." "Excuse me, Miss Dashwood. I believe I have been wrong to say so much, but I hardly know what to do. On your prudence I have the strongest dependence. Tell me that it is all absolutely resolved at any attempt, that in short concealment, if concealment be possible, is all that remains." These words, which conveyed to Eleanor a direct avowal of his love for her sister, affected her very much. She was not immediately able to say anything, and even when her spirits were recovered, she debated for a short time on the answer it would be most proper to give. The real state of things between Willoughby and her sister was so little known to herself, that in endeavoring to explain it, she might be as liable to say too much as too little. Yet, as she was convinced that Marianne's affection for Willoughby could leave no hope of Colonel Brandon's success, whatever the event of that affection might be, at the same time wished to shield her conduct from censure. She thought it most prudent and kind, after some consideration, to say more than she really knew or believed. She acknowledged, therefore, that though she had never been informed by themselves of the terms on which they stood with each other, Of their mutual affection she had no doubt, and of their correspondence she was not astonished to hear. He listened to her with a silent attention, and on her ceasing to speak, rose directly from his seat, and after saying in a voice of emotion, oh boy, this is a line, guys, I hope you're ready. To your sister I wish all imaginable happiness. To Willoughbe, that he may endeavour to deserve her, took leave and went away. I'm okay. I'm fine. Eleanor derived no comfortable feelings. Sounds is right. I'm okay. Okay. Eleanor derived no comfortable feelings from this conversation to lessen the uneasiness of her mind on other points. She was left, on the contrary, with a melancholy impression of Colonel Brandon's unhappiness, and was prevented even from wishing it removed by her anxiety for the very event that must confirm it. Honk. Let's back up. Let's rewind. Do that line again. To your sister I wish all imaginable happiness. To Willoughbe, that he may endeavour to deserve her. Wow. Damn. Anyways, ladies and gents, if somebody really likes you, they'll make themselves known. They'll make it work. And if they don't, they won't. And that sucks. Chapter 6. Unless you're like me and you're just like, let me just bottle this shit up as far down as we possibly can. Nothing occurred the next 3 or 4 days to make Eleanor regret what she had done in applying to her mother, for Willoughbe neither came nor wrote. They were engaged about the end of that time to attend Lady Middleton to a party, from which Mrs. Jennings was kept away by the indisposition of her youngest daughter, and for this party Marianne, wholly dispirited, careless of her appearance, and seeming equally indifferent whether she went or stayed, prepared without one look of hope or one expression of pleasure. She sat by the drawing-room fire after tea till the moment of Lady Middleton's arrival, without once stirring from her seat or altering her attitude, lost in her own thoughts and insensible of her sister's presence. And when at last they were told that Lady Middleton waited for them at the door, she stared as if she had forgotten that any one was expected. I know, Dane, that's what I just acquiesced. Some people are shy, and it sucks. But see, Colonel Brandon, he could say what he needed to say. Not to Marianne, but definitely to her sister, which is as good as saying it to Marianne. Anyways, I'm bitter. They arrived at due time at the place of destination, and as soon as the string of carriages before them would allow, alighted, ascended the stairs, heard their names announced from one landing place to another in an audible voice, and entered a room splendidly lit up, quite full of company, and insufferably hot. When they paid their tribute of politeness by curtsying to the lady of the house, they were permitted to mingle in the crowd and take their share of the heat and inconvenience, to which their arrival must necessarily add. After some time spent in saying little and doing less, Lady Middleton sat down to Cassino, and as Marianne was not in spirits for moving about, she and Eleanor, luckily succeeding to chairs, placed themselves at no great distance from the table. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy! They had not remained in this manner long before Eleanor perceived Willoughbe standing within a few yards of them, in earnest conversation with a very fashionable-looking young woman. I knew that Willoughbe would be there as soon as they said that Marianne was not careful in what she was wearing. Because that's the only time you ever see the people you like, when you're like, oh, damn it. She soon caught his eye, and he immediately bowed, but without attempting to speak to her or to approach Marianne, though he could not but see her, and then continued his discourse with the same lady. Eleanor turned involuntarily to Marianne to see whether it could be unobserved by her. At the moment she first perceived him, and her whole countenance glowing with sudden delight, she would have moved towards him instantly, had not her sister caught hold of her. Eleanor's like, oh my God. And she's like, oh my God. Good "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. He is here! He is there! He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?" "Pray, pray, be composed," cried Eleanor, "and do not betray what you feel to everybody present. Perhaps he has not observed you yet." It's me versus me in my head. That's shit. This, however, was more than she could believe herself, and to be composed I'm lightheaded. Give me a second. This, however, was more than she could believe herself, and to be composed at such a moment was not only beyond the reach of Marianne, it was beyond her wish. She sat in an agony of impatience which affected every feature. At last he turned round again and regarded them both. She started up, and pronouncing his name in a tone of affection, held out her hand to him. He approached, and addressing himself rather to Eleanor than Marianne, oh my God! As if wishing to avoid her eye and determined not to observe her attitude, inquired in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood, and asked how long they had been in town. Eleanor was robbed of all presence of mind by such an address. I love, the way that she says, Eleanor was like, what the fuck? Eleanor was robbed of all presence of mind by such an address and was unable to say a word. Eleanor was like, but the feeling of her sister were instantly expressed. Her face was crimsoned over, and she exclaimed in a voice of the greatest emotion, "Good God! Willoughbe, what is the meaning of this? Have you not received my letters? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not then avoid it, but her touch seemed painful to him, and he held her hand only for a moment. During all this time he was evidently struggling for composure. Eleanor watched his countenance and saw its expression become more tranquil. After a moment's pause, he spoke with calmness. Oh my God, I forgot his voice. It's been so long. I think it was really stupid. Okay. I did myself the honor of calling at Berkeley. This is too stupid. I did myself the honor of calling in Berkeley Street last Tuesday, and very much regretted that I was not fortunate enough to find yourselves and Mrs. Jennings at home. My card was not lost, I hope. But have you not received my notes? Cried Marianne, in the wildest anxiety. Here is some mistake, I am sure, some dreadful mistake. What can be the meaning of it? Tell me, Willoughbe, for heaven's sake, what is the matter? He made no reply. His complexion changed, and all his embarrassment returned. But, as if, on catching the eye of the young lady with whom he had been previously talking, he felt the necessity of instant exertion, recovered himself again, and after saying, "Yes, I had the pleasure of receiving the information of your arrival in town," he's starting to get a Cockney accent, boy. "Yes, I had the pleasure of receiving the information of your arrival in town." I'm so sorry. I'm really going off today. The information of your arrival in town, which you were so good to send me, turned hastily away with a slight bow and joined his friend. Marianne, now looking dreadfully white, and unable to stand, sunk into her chair, and Eleanor, expecting every moment to see her faint, tried to screen her from the observation of others, while reviving her with lavender water. Oh my God, the Dashwood sisters are having a night. "Go to him, Eleanor," she cried as soon as she could speak, "and force him to come to me. Tell him I must see him again, must speak to him instantly. I cannot rest. I shall not have a moment's peace till this is explained. Some dreadful misapprehension or other. Oh, go to him this moment." "How can that be done? No, my dearest Marianne, you must wait. This is not the place for explanations. Wait only till tomorrow." With difficulty, however, could she prevent her from following him herself, and to persuade her to check her agitation, to wait, at least with the appearance of composure, till she might speak to him with more privacy and more effect, was impossible, for Marianne continued incessantly to give way in a low voice to the misery of her feelings by exclamations of wretchedness. In a short time, Eleanor saw Willoughbe quit the room by the door towards the staircase, and telling Marianne that he was gone, urged the impossibility of speaking to him again that evening as a fresh argument for her to be calm. She instantly begged her sister would entreat Lady Middleton to take them home, as she was too miserable to stay a minute longer. Lady Middleton, though in the middle of a rubber, on being informed that Marianne was unwell, was too polite to object for a moment to her wish of going away, and making over her cards to a friend, they departed as soon as the carriage could be found. Scarcely a word was spoken during their return to Berkeley Street. Marianne in silent agony, too much oppressed even for tears. But as Mrs. Jennings was luckily not come home, they could go directly to their own room, where Hartshorn restored her a little to herself. She was soon undressed and in bed, and as she seemed desirous of being alone, her sister then left her, and while she waited the return of Mrs. Jennings, had leisure enough for thinking over the past. That some kind of engagement had subsisted between Willoughby and Marianne she could not doubt, and that Willoughby was weary of it seemed equally clear, for however Marianne might still feed her own wishes, she could not attribute such behaviour to mistake or misapprehensions of any kind. Nothing but a thorough chance of sentiment, nothing but but a thorough change of sentiment could account for it. Her indignation would have been still stronger than it was, had she not witnessed that embarrassment which seemed to speak a consciousness of his own misconduct, and prevented her from believing him so unprincipled as to have been sporting with affections of her sister from the first, without any design that would bear investigation. Absence might have weakened his regard, and convenience might have determined him to overcome it, but that such a regard had formerly existed she could not bring herself to doubt. As for Marianne, on the pangs which so unhappy a meeting must already have given her, and on those still more severe which might await her in its probable consequence, she could not reflect without the deepest concern. Her own situation gained in the comparison, for while she could esteem Edward as much as ever, however they might be divided in the future, her mind might always supported. But every circumstance that could embitter such an evil seemed uniting to heighten the misery of Marianne in a final separation from Willoughby, in an immediate and irreconcilable rupture from him. All right, that's the end of chapter. Woof. What a doozy. That sucks. Poor Marianne. Oh, she's just a sweet girl. Just a sweet little girl. I mean, she's not that little, but she's also like still little. She's just so sweet and so believing and like, oh, honey. Oh, I'm so sorry. That sucks so hard. Cause I think Eleanor's just like, okay, they weren't like engaged, but there was something. Like they said something. And I'm sure Marianne was like, yo, I love you. And Willoughby was like, yeah, why not? Sure, everybody loves me. um, and just, boy, what a time. What a time to be alive. But just, oh, you got a big thing coming to you, honey. Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Today is Friday. Tomorrow is Saturday. I will be in around 3 tomorrow. I'm going to be filming my short film tomorrow, so that should be fun. And I will see you all then. It has been, as usual, wonderful to check in with you. Excuse me. And I look forward to checking in again tomorrow at 3. Thanks for coming in. I will see. How many times will I say tomorrow? I don't know. Let's toss it in a couple more times. I'll sing Annie. Annie will sing us out. All right. Bye. Tomorrow, I love ya tomorrow.